My first memory of Scott is in 5th grade. I don't see the wisdom now, but it was somebody's bright idea in my hometown, Holman, Wisconsin, to create an open lunch hour for 5th graders, which for the gang that I ran around with meant a trip about a third of a mile, half a mile from the school to the local IGA grocery store. My target was usually a banana flip. But that day, Scotty had another idea. He said, if you buy a big bag of cookies, then they put it in a big brown grocery bag, and then you can stand by the hard candy rack and just fill it with candy. It was bald-faced stealing, and even now I recoil at how disturbing it is that a 11-year-old, 10-year-old young man would think like that. It's a sickening kind of a thing. I can still remember looking back over my shoulder as Mr. Seisha, the store owner, stepped out of the store as we walked down the street. He was a member of our church. I was friends with his kids, and he looked at us really suspiciously. I have to confess that later in the afternoon classroom, it was Mrs. Bradley's civics class that I did accept a root beer barrel that was passed around the classroom. Kind of ironic, isn't it? A civics class, a class on responsible behavior in society, specifically civil behavior. With all respect to Jack and Janet Jarms, who are members of our church, they've taught civics for many years. This is not a sermon about making democracy work and how we participate responsibly in a democratic society, but rather about behaving as a pathway along the way of an awakening faith. Thou shalt not steal. If you've internalized a moral foundation in your life, stop for a moment and give thanks to God. If someone loved into you a right and a wrong, if someone with the support of a local faith community helped you absorb a conscience that allows you to be honest and compels you to want to be responsible and trustworthy, just thank God. It's a great gift. We all know what happens in our lives. We all know what happens in society when the latter is the case. We all know what happens when family is not honored and families disintegrate. We all know what happens when one group of people look over on another group of people and regard them as less than human, as subhuman, and treat them that way. We all know what happens in society when sex becomes our petty little God. We all know what happens when we lie and when we are filled with just a wanton desire for something more, someone that's supposed to fill this emptiness that is a part of being human at times. We all know what happens, and if we've absorbed a moral foundation in life, our neighbors are truly blessed. It's a blessing from God. But I want us to pause for a moment as we think about this sermon today. The point of this sermon, of an awakening pathway that includes behaving, is not the admonition, behave. It's partly that. That's a gift from God, the commandments at the core of our life. But it's not so much behave as it is discovering behaviors and behaving as a fundamental pathway, point of the pathway in awakening faith. Let's remember our reference point in this worship series. The rapidly growing number of people who find the Christian faith to be at best irrelevant and at worst destructive. Stop for a moment and think about it. Picture right now your circle of relationships, the people you hang out with, your family, your friends, your colleagues, your coworkers, the people that you interact with in your hobbies and things that you enjoy doing. Think about those especially who are younger. How many are becoming a stranger to the Christian faith? How many do you know who are described by the trends that you see in this diagram? Scotty was in my confirmation class about 3 years after the root beer barrel heist. There were 35 of us confirmed at the Holman Lutheran Church in 1973. If we were to survey that group today, I wonder how many would say the church is irrelevant in their life. My home church meant well, and it's filled with wonderful people, but creating a pathway to an awakening faith in the lives of young people is tough. The pathway, the gate is narrow, Jesus said. And when we watch what Jesus did, we see the pathway of an awakening of faith arises, how it arises in all of our lives and even in the lives of teenagers. Jesus began by going to people. He went to people. The whole story of his life is all about him traveling and engaging and taking interest in people's lives where they were. His life became an invitation, an open door to the diagram that we see here, this pathway of an awakening faith. His first followers saw in Jesus a window into their own soul, into their struggles and their longings. He spent a lot of time with them creating community. They were amazed to become his friends, laughing together, questioning, learning, sharing their hopes and dreams. We all yearn, every human being yearns for belonging and the creating of life-giving relationships. And when the church is at its best, that's exactly what we do. And it's out of these life-giving, welcoming relationships that behaving and believing the steps along the pathway that we see here are able to take place in our lives. We've tended to see, for example, confirmation in the Lutheran Church as this time to learn the doctrine of the church, kind of an intellectual exercise of learning to believe, but without experiencing an open door and meaningful relationships with people who take a genuine interest in our lives, who engage in our lives. People get lost. People get lost on the pathway of an awakening faith. I sat behind Scotty on the team bus after a football game during our senior year. He was our quarterback, and he'd gotten dinged pretty good in that game. He said his head was hurting. He couldn't remember what day it was. He was having trouble thinking straight. And some of my teammates and me kind of thought he was seeking attention, but who knows, in light of what we now know about football, maybe that injury partly explains the next 40 years of his life. Only weeks after we graduated from high school, he strong-armed one of our classmates and stole the bank deposit that our classmate was making after his shift ended at the local 5 and Dime. That was the beginning of Scott spending some 21 of the next 35 years in prison. He'd get released and then break into cabins along the Black River. He'd get released and get another DWI. He'd get released and steal a vehicle, and off he'd go. A cycle of in and out of prison the rest of his life. It's so sad. But remember that Jesus, who called himself the gate, the narrow gate, also called himself the way. Literally, in the original Greek of the New Testament, Jesus is saying, I am the road. Or as we teach in this worship series, the the pathway. Jesus' way, Jesus' road is a resurrection road, where what seems impossible is made possible. Jesus makes a way where we see no way. About 10 years ago, Scotty wrote to me while incarcerated, and we began to correspond. He'd send me these amazing handmade cards. Who knew that hard-headed cur was an artist? They were beautiful. And he would share what was going on in his life. I'd write him back. I ended up visiting him at the Racine County Correctional Facility there in Sturtevant. You know, we were in our mid-50s by then, but he was still that straight-backed young man I remembered from so many years ago. One day, about a year after that visit, he called me on the phone. It was brutally cold, like those February days we just came through. Scotty had been released from prison yet again. He was making his way back to Holman. He needed a place to spend the night. I picked him up and I brought him to the Milwaukee Rescue Mission. There were dozens of men coming off the frozen streets that night. The prison system had given Scotty a bus ticket to make it to Holman to La Crosse the next day. But that's about all he had. I gave him $20 for food. But I told him I wasn't sure if it was a good idea to give him any money because I could tell he'd been drinking that day. He assured me he'd be okay. And a week later, he mailed me that $20 bill back and thanked me for trusting him. Don't give up. My brothers and sisters in Christ, don't give up. God's mercy is great and it endures forever. Jesus stands as an open door with his arms wide stretched, reaching all the way to where you and I are and reaching through us with his call, with his invitation, with his love, with his mercy. Don't give up. If we take interest in the sufferings of the world, if someone sees that we genuinely care enough to listen to their life stories, to respect where they are coming from, together we can practice and absorb the behaviors of the followers of Jesus, developing friendship, studying his word, learning to pray, and becoming a sacrament of dialogue, a sacrament of communion and community for the world. This depth of behaving is possible right here, right now. The last time that I heard from Scotty, my cell phone rang as Ann and I were sitting down in the theater about to watch a movie, and I couldn't accept the call at that moment. I intended to call later, and it took a few days for me to finally do that, and when I did, his number was disconnected. I had a feeling he'd arrived, as he had told me not too long before that he was headed to North Carolina. He said, "I'll be able to live outside there." I knew he had nothing, and I didn't want to even go there and ask what he meant by living outside in North Carolina. He'd also told me in that last conversation that he'd found a church there, that he'd found a faith community, and he was almost amazed to himself, in spite of himself, that after all those years, he'd found a church that felt real. He said the pastor was real kind, and she was a wonderful preacher, and he was part of their Bible studies, and he volunteered in their food pantry. You could just hear the joy in his voice as he described finding a faith community and walking that path. I was so happy for him. We shared that joy together in that last conversation. About a year later, I heard that Scotty died when he was stabbed living in a camp in North Carolina where the homeless had set up a place to live outdoors. I managed to track down the church that he'd been part of. I found out that they had indeed, and they were scheduling his memorial service, his funeral. I saw the little opportunity for people to write notes. I saw that they described Scotty as someone who had challenges, but who was a much-loved participant in their church. I wrote them a note and thanked them. Thanked them for loving Scott. Thanked them for being the church with him. And thanked them for taking care of our quarterback.